Welcome to my second webinar on feelings, chakra, and manifestation. I'm afraid the title is very condensed because it really means primordial feelings, the various chakra of the body, the energy centers within our energy system, and how we manifest or don't manifest to fulfill our desires and um, do the things that we want to do. Last month, the webinar was primarily on how fear affects the first chakra. And when I talk about these, feelings interacting with various chakra, the first thing I have to say is the chakra are all interconnected, and the impacts of various things that affect our feelings in a non-positive way are affecting all of the chakra. And it's just that certain feelings affect some of the chakra more than others. They kind of get implanted in there. And that blocks our ability to do what we want to do, to face the tasks and responsibilities that we all have, and to fulfill our dreams, to do the big things that we want to accomplish in life. Last month, we talked about fear, and I pointed out that the emphasis that I was making in that presentation, which you can find online on my YouTube channel, um, was the fears that we bring into this life with us from past lives, and the fears that we acquire very early in life. Um, and those are picked up in a way that is more subconscious really than conscious. It's not so much that we have specific traumas, although we might, but it's more the subtle things that go on in our life. Maybe our mother, maybe we were the first child, our mother was a new mother, was kind of nervous about being a mother and had a lot of apprehension and was perhaps given suggestions and advice by various other women, and occasionally by doctors, that implanted a set of rules that made them quite anxious, actually, about fulfilling what they thought or saw as their responsibility to their child. And um, that gets conveyed to a baby on a very subtle level. It's a feeling thing. They can feel it when they're being fed, when they're being held, how the mother and also, of course, the father and other caregivers respond to the baby when it has various needs, certainly to eat, to sleep, to burp, um, to move its bowels, um, and to adjust its temperature, all the things that a baby has to try to convey with a limited vocabulary. Babies do have some vocabulary in the sounds that they make. And as parents, we can learn to recognize those sounds, but um, they don't have a big vocabulary to communicate with us. And so it's very important, for instance, that a mother be tuned in to what the baby's trying to communicate, because otherwise the baby winds up frustrated. It has a need. It tries to express that need as best it can. Um, if the more subtle signs and sounds and gestures that the baby makes don't work, then it tries things that are more intense, and it may wind up crying a great deal. Um, I know that it's been demonstrated many times, and I've seen it with my own children, that when parents respond to a child fairly promptly, the child develops a certain confidence that if it does a certain thing, either moves or makes certain sounds, that the parents are going to respond. And so it builds up an expectation over time that its needs will be met. And so it trusts that, and that trust allows a longer and longer period between when the baby gives its signal and when it loses it, when the signal is not responded to. And I learned about this, I was studying physiology, and it was one of the things that was presented when it was talking about behavioral physiology, the things that were happening in the body, and how that produced behaviors and responses. Was a very fascinating topic to me, actually. And ultimately, of course, I became a pediatrician because I found that kind of connection and communication between infants and their parents to be very fascinating work. So, when needs are not met in infancy, it builds up a certain tension in the child. So some of the tensions may be acquired from the mother by her insecurities, some of them from the baby itself by not getting its needs met. And so it gets frustrated, and that as I was describing how a baby can learn, if its needs are generally met quickly, to wait longer and longer for that to happen. The opposite happens if its needs are not being met, and that is that it becomes a baby that cries very quickly and falls apart, as we say, or loses it very quickly when the needs are not met. And so the opposite happens, and that feeling in the baby, that anxiety that it's not going to have its needs met, um, becomes deeply implanted in the physiology. It's a very, what I call a primordial feeling, meaning it's essential in the physiology, and it'll carry through often for the rest of one's life. And we just describe it to a certain temperament in a person, or a certain quality of their character, that they're maybe an anxious person, or easily upset, or not not well focused, and not trusting. And we'll see, there's a whole long list of behaviors that evolve out of this fundamental tendency to expect that one's needs are not going to be met. Um, so that was what we talked about last month. And we talked about how that tends to settle in the first chakra. It's not only in the first chakra, but that seems to be the primary place it settles. And we did some work then in the group clearing session to try to help everybody clear that fundamental, that primordial fear out of their first chakra, so we could begin to open up the energy so that it would be grounded, because that first chakra has a lot to do with grounding, and the behaviors that are associated with first chakra dysfunction are related to not being well grounded. Um, and that can be physiological, and that can be behavioral and emotional. Um, this month, we're going to move on to uh, the second chakra and the feelings that are often associated there. And I put more feelings with the second chakra because um, it's a little bit more complicated. Um, the second chakra, the primary influence on that, the primary feeling that one has, is the feeling of not being loved, being unloved. We don't have a very good word for that, but it's the uncomfortableness that we're not feeling love coming towards us, and that can be very, very disturbing in a physiology. Um, we can also feel somewhat less intense of a feeling of being unappreciated or just neglected. Maybe our parents just not very attentive, and there can be a whole lot of reasons for that. Their lives are very busy. They're under a lot of stress. Um, there may be other children in the household or other people in the household. So the parents may be very distracted or just generally preoccupied with their own concerns, and maybe just not so attentive um, to their child or children. And so the individual baby winds up with a feeling of not being loved and not being well attended to. This kind of feeling is, again, I would classify it as a primordial feeling for two reasons. Primordial means two things here. One is that we acquire it very early or bring it in with us. And the other is that it becomes so much an essential part of our character, about who we are and how we relate to the world. If we feel unloved and unappreciated and unattended to, um, we tend to just wander in our life. We don't have focus. We can't bring energy into taking care of ourselves and feeling good about ourselves and making decisions that are really useful or valuable for us in moving our life forward. We may feel somewhat confused about life, but certainly and when I say confused, it's not just bewildered type confused. It's more, I don't know who I am. I don't know what I'm worth. And so there's a sense of just not being sure of oneself. So you combine that with first chakra disturbance, not being grounded, not being settled, not being focused clearly on what you're trying to do in life. And then you have this second chakra um, effect. And again, I just every time I say that, based on my experience in working with these things, they're never completely isolated. It's not like this is all first chakra, this is all second chakra. They're interconnected, and with the other chakra too, particularly the third chakra. And so a certain confusion or complication uh, would be created if we said, "Oh, this is second chakra stuff." But there is a tendency for it to settle in the second chakra. And what happens is then the chakra doesn't function very well. Can settle in the way I see it often. If there's a blockage, I was working with someone this week that um, the energy was coming inward instead of going outward. They weren't radiant with energy. It was like it was just um, they were sucking energy from their environment and trying to anyway. Their energy was very weak. I've had another experience recently where the energy came out, but it didn't radiate. It kind of just had no power to it. It just kind of dropped away from them. And so they were losing energy with the appearance. And I've heard other professionals use the expression hemorrhaging energy. And it's definitely using the word hemorrhaging conveys that it's really not a good thing. And of course, they often feel very, very weak, often even physically tired, but they feel they have no power. They're not bringing any energy forward to be able to manifest what they want in life or to meet their responsibilities. And when you have this combination of first chakra, second chakra, a lot of times you get procrastination, not facing up to doing responsibilities, maybe can't get the bills paid on time, or not getting to the grocery store when you need to, not meeting deadlines of other sorts in work, not being able to work very quickly, or efficiently, making a lot of mistakes, being inattentive. Some people even get into auto accidents if they're driving because they're just kind of not there. They're not the common term these days is they're not present. They're not showing up and manifesting, what a person would do if they, were well integrated, if their energy was functioning well. And so our goal in exploring all of this is to come to recognize what kinds of situations maybe am I avoiding or not being successful in or not tackling. Um, maybe I feel like everybody else is more important than I am. This is particularly the subject we're talking about, where we're unloved and unappreciated and maybe not well attended to. And the result is we just don't feel efficacious. We don't feel empowered. Um, we feel impotent, um, lack of power. And and so this can show up not always in every area of life. And that's one of the things that often confuses people when they're trying to figure out what's going on, is that in some areas they may be very effective, and in other areas they're really not. And those are individual considerations why that happens for one person in one way and a different way in another person. It just has to do with their background and what their history, both in this lifetime and in other lifetimes. And then we lay on top of all of these things, the consequences plus other events in our life. So the consequences are, well, I never was able to do certain things. Um, it may come as a surprise that when I was young, speaking in front of a class or any kind of group of people making any kind of presentation was something that I found very difficult to do. It brought enormous anxiety and apprehension. Um, but I worked through that, and that was a good thing, by repeated experience. And I gained confidence. And now, when I sit down to do like this webinar, and I'm reaching out, so to speak, or presenting to all of you out there in cyberspace, plus a few folks here in my living room. And when I'm doing that, I really don't get any apprehension about it at all. It's just something I can do. And, part of that training came, I guess I can say this online. I trained in nonviolent direct action. And one of the things we had to do, I think I told this story last month, I'll tell it very briefly. We had to learn to stand up on literally a box in downtown Philadelphia, and give a presentation we were working against the Vietnam War. And so we would just start talking, and we'd have a bunch of friends, in front of us who would be listening to us. And then as people would come down the sidewalk, they'd stop and they'd listen, and sometimes they'd make comments. And so we learned how to do crowd control and how to engage with somebody, who maybe was having a sincere question, or had a really good comment to make, or those who felt very antagonistic, very negative or hostile even to what we were doing, and might express themselves quite strongly. And anyway, that was a very fascinating experience, but it was one of the ways that I learned to overcome my shyness about that. Now, the whole point of all this story is that we often learn to push through our fears. We learn to push through the feeling that nobody really cares about me. I'm not really loved. I'm not important. And I don't feel important to myself. And we do things, and we actually may be very successful in presenting ourselves to the world and being able to stand up for ourselves in certain situations. But the point is that these primordial feelings don't go away. They're still there. And so I remember one young man that I knew when I was practicing pediatrics, um, and he engaged in theatrical uh, things, plays and such. And every time before he would go on stage, he'd go in the bathroom and whoops his cookies, as we used to say. He'd throw up or vomit, and um, and then he'd go on stage and he'd be fine. But the anxiety would build up, and he would literally let it out of his body, and then he could go on stage and he'd be fine. Once he started, he was okay. Um, and he had a hard time learning that, oh, I am going to be okay. I don't really need to get all this anxiety. But one of the reasons he couldn't do that, he couldn't clear that anxiety, wasn't just the intellectual thing of, oh, I know I'm going to be all right. It was that it was so deep in his physiology. It was set in his chakra. I didn't know that at the time. I've learned those abilities to perceive those things more recently. But back in those days, I was watching him go through this, and the poor guy was, he was very, he felt very badly about it. And, uh, but he managed to get on stage every time. He did just fine. You would never have known that he had that difficulty. So what we want to do is to clear out this primordial fear, this very deep level um, of fear and feeling unloved. And next month we're going to do some other feelings: guilt, shame, and I have to look at my list because I have trouble remembering them all. Doubt, disappointment, and rejection, which is fourth chakra stuff, and then the guilt, shame, and yeah, guilt. Well, it's guilt and shame mainly, um, that get the third chakra. And I'll have some more on my list, but I made very quick notes here tonight. I didn't get them all down. So we'll do that next month. So just want to think about how we acquire those feelings. I just want to make sure I covered everything. Um, Feeling unloved has a lot to do with the way a baby interacts with its parents and other caregivers, its siblings. It has to do with the tone of the environment. Is there a lot of yelling? Is there a lot of, uh, you know, arguing and things going on in the environment? Or is it more settled? Is it calm and collected? When the environment is highly disturbed, even if it's not directed at the baby picks up the vibration, the sound of that, and the feeling of people. Maybe it's handled kind of roughly, not necessarily abused, but just not handled gently. And maybe people don't sit and just talk to it and look it in the eye. My gosh, I spent some time with my granddaughter today. She's 5 months, going on 6 months old now, born prematurely though. And she, when she looks you in the eye, it's like this. I imitated that fairly well. You should see her. She's just like really intense. But when I say intense, meaning focused, it's not. There's no tension in her. She's just taking it in. It's like, oh, I can see you. And I actually was able to snap a picture of her looking at her mother, and it was just so sweet, because she was just looking up at her like that, and having that connection with her, and that security that comes in that. And that's the opposite of what happens, in the absence of that. Babies feel like they feel unsafe. And so part of that turns into fear. Part of that turns into the feeling of not being loved or appreciated, or just feeling connected to their caregivers. Um, and so there's this sense of, do I belong? This question. It's not a question in a baby's mind. They don't ask the question that way. It's a feeling of, I'm moving in my chair here to sort of illustrate. It's like I'm not settled in this place. I'm unsettled. My life is not safe and secure and comfortable and connected to caregivers. So this early connection to caregivers is extremely important to babies. And if they don't get it, they can develop what we call attachment disorder. And that can be very, very severe. So as they get to be larger children, they may have very poor control over their behavior. And parents are often then very critical of them. You're such a bad kid. You're always breaking things. You're always doing things you shouldn't do, maybe endangering yourself. And so the people are reacting. I'm just throwing all these things out in case they resonate at all, so that when we do the group clearing session, you'll have that, you'll have material to work on. You'll remember what it is that's going on inside you that you most of the time are not aware of. If you spend a lot of time in introspection, you may be more aware of it. But a lot of people don't even realize they hold these feelings, and thus their life it's just like, that's just who I am. It's just how it is, and their life is not really in their control. So it just kind of crawls along, as it were. Excuse me. Not as productive as they'd like it to be, and often with a lot of inhibitions, blocks that keep them from being able to do the things that they want or need to do. I think that's probably enough of a general explanation of that. So I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions first in the house, if anyone has anything they want to ask me. Everyone is deep in thought. And then people, if you would online, if you'd like to use the chat function, that would be good. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little button that says chat, and you can put a question or a comment in there. I'm opening my chat window here so I can receive your comments. Very good. Okay, well, not having any questions, then I'm going to conclude the presentation portion of this. Thank you all for joining us. Oh, a question has come up in the house. Go ahead.
So, if one of your parents was depressed when you were small,
I'll repeat the question. Yeah. Hmm. So the question is, if one of your parents was clinically depressed, really seriously depressed, and we're probably talking about people who can't get out of bed in the morning, maybe spend all day in bed, um, don't attend to daily tasks very well, and certainly don't attend to a child um, effectively. What effect would that have? Um, I'm smiling because I'm just thinking, just imagine yourself for a moment, assuming you did not grow up in that kind of environment. Just imagine yourself for a moment being around someone who really wasn't attending to you, acted like you didn't matter, that they didn't care about you, that was very quiet, for one thing, um, and probably not getting things done, maybe not getting meals prepared or laundry accomplished, and certainly not up to playing and interacting with you. Anybody who's been around children knows that children are very dynamic, even from just a couple of months old. Their interaction, as I was describing before, just looking with their eyes, and then as they start to be able to interact with their hands, and then as they're able to crawl around and walk around, run around, and once they're running, it's like chase me. They're all over the place. I have this image in my mind of my youngest running up and down the sidewalk yelling, chase me," because she wanted her older sister, to come chase her. So um, children are very dynamic, and it takes a lot of energy to keep up with them. Well, when a person is depressed, they have like no energy, right? They're just doing anything is just so much work. It's just so hard to do. It's so hard to find that energy. Well, where's the block of that energy? It's primarily in the second chakra. It can also be in the first and the third. And then, of course, it can also be in the fourth chakra, which is the heart chakra, because everything emotionally goes through the fourth chakra. But it takes root, really. That kind of depressive thing takes root in the second chakra. Um, and so it just blocks our ability. It's like we're always doubting who we are and whether we matter, and being able to ask and receive. Receiving is a big issue with the second chakra, because when it works well, we are able to receive well, but that's because we have received as a child, as an infant. And so when we're not getting that over the months and years of childhood, yeah, we wind up with that feeling of we're not loved, we're not cared for, we don't matter. And we doubt that we deserve and doubt that we can receive love. And so we may test, particularly as we get older and we start to entertain the possibility of relationships, we may test relationships. I've seen that so often in clinical practice where people, it's like they're trying to ruin their relationships. That's what it looks like sometimes from the outside. It's like, here's a good opportunity. You've met somebody and you really care about them and they care about you. And then you do this stuff and it makes you look like you're trying to sabotage the relationship. What you're doing is testing it. Do they really care about me? I don't really believe that I'm not capable of believing that they care about me because of what I've been through as a child. So that's not everything, but I hope that's at least a good start on an answer. And if that's an issue, we can work on that tonight here. So I'm going to conclude this recording. I'm not seeing any comments coming in from cyberspace. So I'm going to conclude this recording and then we'll pick up with our group clearing session.